the best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Singapore's indie film scene has just lost one of its most recognizable names. After more than a decade of screening art house films, cult favorites, and hosting community events, the Projector announced that it would cease operations immediately. The cinema cited rising operating costs, shifting audience habits, and the global decline in cinema attendance as reasons for its closure. But for many cinephiles and artists, the Projector was more than just a theater. It was a cultural hub and a rare gathering space outside the mainstream. So is Singapore simply too small for indie cinema? How much of it is about changing cultural appetites? And beyond just film, what might the Projector's absence mean for the wider arts community? Well, joining us today to share more is Dr Jinna Tay, who's a senior lecturer of communications and new media at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Tay, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Dr. Tay, the closure of the Projector seems abrupt, especially since screenings have been advertised just days before. Did this come as a shock? Were there already warning signs there, considering previous moves like cutting screenings at Golden Mile and closing Cineleisure?
I think it came as a shock, yes. Even though, as you mentioned, there's been all these sorts of different lapses or, cutting of screenings, and these sorts of things are sometimes acceptable for independent cinemas because we know that they're small operators and clients and patrons are often very accepting of these sorts of changes, last-minute small changes with small operators. So I think a total shutdown like this has had its kind of cultural reverberations in the entire social sector, right? So everyone would have woken up to social media, everyone posting about this, people commentating about how much loss they feel, right, for the loss of an independent space like that.
Right. So what were the key factors that led to this sudden decision? I mean, which pressures do you think weighed most heavily on its survival?
Yes, well, the owners haven't kind of been open in kind of outlining everything, but we are all familiar with the rental pressures, right? It's not too long ago that Cathay also had that issue and still thinking about whether or not they will actually stay open or whether they will completely close itself down, and all these different pressures from all the different operators. Rental has always been one of the highest pressure that they faced.
Right. I mean, then how does Singapore's indie cinema landscape compare to other regional cities like Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, or even Hong Kong?
It's actually an interesting question, right? Because we're all kind of top Asian cities and we're all megalopolis in that sense. We all have a lot of huge population. I think the difference, though, is that in Bangkok, they do have independent cinemas as small as like 50 seaters, so they do have very, very tiny spaces that caters to more of like a village audience, in that sense. I don't mean village as in, being in a village, but like in terms of its spatiality. So it's small, it's targeted, it hosts local productions. Whereas I think that with a lot of Singapore patrons and cinema goers, even though a lot of us actually go to the Projector to watch films, but it's not necessarily just local films, right? But in spaces such as Bangkok and Hong Kong, these are two capitals that actually have a lot of film production. They can actually cater to films that cater to just their local filmmakers, right? And I think that makes a little bit of a difference as well, right? Because they're showcasing local films.
I mean, the cinema's co-founder said that they had fought to keep it alive through challenges from the pandemic to expansion. So could anything have been done differently that might have helped them survive longer?
I think they've negotiated that downfall as best they could. I think their patrons have all been very wholehearted in supporting them. I think, the Projector has always been, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I went there to try to get to a film that I wanted to see and it was sold out. So that's actually quite common with the Projector, So a lot of times the evenings slots and all that are actually sold out. So they're actually, they are actually filling up the cinemas in those slots. But of course, I think some of the issue might also be that daytime is all empty, right? So these are spaces that are only used after hours. So what can they do in the day, perhaps, to utilize some of those spaces? Corporate events, tying up with other sort of corporate things, maybe perhaps to kind of rent out the spaces and sublet those spaces in some way, right? To kind of help them get abreast of the venue costs.
Then what does its closure mean for filmmakers as well as audiences who relied on the projector as a venue for alternative screenings?
I definitely think that the independent art scene and cinephiles, as you mentioned, and, just people who love international films that are not in the mainstream, I think everyone's going to feel this loss, right? Whether you go to an independent film once a year, once every 2 years, or you're one of the devoted fans that go every month or every time there's something new, you're going to feel that loss. As it is, I think Singapore does not have that many independent spaces. It does not have that many spaces that host local films or quirky films, right? Things that you don't often get to see. Movie marathons, even small different corporate events where they can actually screen quirky films for you, for your whole organization. It's the projector has occupied that space, and for a lot of people in the arts community, it was a meeting ground. It was, if you go there are places that, people, the faces that you see them week after week there, right? So it's a place where people have come to feel like a third space, as people have been talking about that online.
Right. I mean, beyond cinemas, we've seen bookshops, music venues, and even other independent spaces, face similar struggles in Singapore. So do you think the projector's closure is a one-off case?
It's definitely not a one-off case. We have seen the decimation of a lot of these cultural facilities, right? As you mentioned, all these different examples of bookshops and cinemas, just spaces where that it's not heavily profit-oriented or where it is not subsidized. I think it is hard to maintain the financial viability, especially when it caters to students or artistic community where profit is not the main factor. Like, they're still trying to make a profit, but they are not charging the most premium prices, right? Because they're trying to cater to the community. So these community, I think, would definitely feel a loss. And, I think there's always the thought that what's going to happen to such community, right? If we want creative people, if we want people to have a place where they can come together to talk about creative things and screen and, participate in things, then we need to keep these sorts of spaces open. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, does its closure signal a broader difficulty as well for all so-called third spaces here in Singapore, not just film-related ones?
Definitely, most definitely. Yes. I think that the challenge has always been there, and the bottom line has always been about rental spaces, how to maximize that. So definitely, I think that, there's not many places that would not consider as a big writing on the wall,
Right. Well, do you think there should be more government support, to sustain indie cinemas and alternative cultural spaces?
Well, while it would be nice to have government subsidies, it would have to come as a strings unattached kind of situation, right? Because for it to be a community third space, it does need to be independent. It does need to operate as and how it wants to operate. And unfortunately, I don't think any government in the world would often just, subsidize spaces with very little conditions, right? So I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think it would be lovely if government would step in and say, look, there is a bit of fund that you can apply for, but these are also profit-driven organizations, so it's hard for them to reconcile that, right, to operating remits for government.
Definitely. Well, on the other hand, mainstream chains like Golden Village and Shaw, they still operate multiple outlets here. So how do you see mainstream cinemas in Singapore faring compared to indie ones? Can their scale give them a cushion that the projector lacked?
Well, no, we've seen the demise of Ainhua, of Cathay. So we know that I think cinemas is a challenge, not just in Singapore, but globally, right? We have seen cinema patrons fall off in line with the rise in kind of SVOD culture or streaming cultures with pirating, downloading, and all the different ways in which you can access films and television content now. Definitely, we do see a decline, right, in physical cinema attendance.
I mean, as you mentioned, streaming platforms have been blamed for declining cinema attendance. So how big a role did, they play in reshaping Singapore's movie watching culture?
I don't have the data to back this. I don't have the data to back. A lot of, the more recent sort of films we've had, like, for example, Avengers, and they tried to use that streaming platform, right, as a way to lead in more audience to bring them back into the cinematic space, right? So they try and use film and television. They try and use a streaming platform and the cinematic kind of space as well. So they tell the story, part of the story here, and then to lead viewers to the other space. But I don't think it has been that successful. So where people have already been paying for streaming platforms, especially, then, there really is very little reason for them to go to cinemas, except for when you actually do want that social experience, So cinemas are wonderful for that social experience, and it does not come cheap, right? So I think people do weigh the pros and cons between that.
Well, then, given the broader global trend of declining cinema attendance here, Dr. Tay, what's your outlook for the future of cinemas in Singapore?
Oh, I really hope that our mainstream cinemas stay afloat as well. I do think that people are keen to keep these distribution theaters and, spaces. If they want to keep these spaces open, then they need to vote with their feet, and they need to actually go and attend and buy tickets, and they need to stop pirating. Or perhaps sometimes people pirate because they actually like a film and they want to watch it again, right? So I'm saying that people actually just need to actually attend some of these cultural events to keep it going. Yeah.
Definitely. And looking at its decade-long journey again here, what lessons can other independent ventures in Singapore take away from this, Dr. Tay? Can anything step in to fill the gap the Projector leaves behind?
I think it's a good question. I guess it's going to be a while before anyone's going to venture into trying to capitalize on this market. It's a tough one, but there are people out there who are looking for a new home. I'm not sure that, I think there's a lot of lessons that you can take away, right, from this. Some of that would be really thinking about some of the economic models and the costs, right? How to actually be able to share some of the venue costs, for example, perhaps trying to make it more sustainable by having multiple use spaces, right? Or like in Bangkok, having really tiny ones, tiny seaters, or open plan sittings that allows you to kind of adapt the space for other purposes, right? So the idea here is to try and offload, I suppose, the main cost, right? But also some of the licensing, whether or not they can negotiate some of the licensing to help them.
Right. Some great information from you there. Thank you so much, Dr. Tay, for joining me today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was Dr. Jinna Tay, Senior Lecturer of Communications and New Media at the National University of Singapore. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.